In early 2022, investigators in Minnesota began uncovering something that should not have been possible. Millions of dollars in public funds, money intended to feed children from low-income families, had quietly disappeared from a federally funded nutrition program. The payments had been approved, the paperwork had been processed, and reimbursements had already been issued. Yet the meals those funds were meant to provide had never existed. At first, there was no dramatic discovery. No single audit triggered an immediate shutdown. No system alarm sounded. Instead, the problem revealed itself slowly, through patterns that did not quite make sense when examined closely. The money moved the way it always had. Incrementally, routinely, legally, at least on paper. Each reimbursement request appeared valid. Each claim followed the established process. Each payment passed through the same approval channels that had handled thousands of legitimate transactions over the years. Nothing about the process looked unusual on the surface. That normalcy is what allowed the problem to grow. For years, the system did exactly what it was designed to do. It processed paperwork. It approved claims. It moved money efficiently from federal programs to local organizations tasked with providing meals. And that design would become its greatest weakness. According to court records, what investigators eventually uncovered would become one of the largest fraud investigations in Minnesota's history. Dozens of organizations were implicated. Hundreds of millions of dollars were scrutinized. And a system built on trust was exposed as dangerously vulnerable to abuse. This was not a story about a single nonprofit exploiting a loophole. It was not the result of one careless mistake or a single dishonest actor. It was a story about how large systems fail quietly. The failure did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, over months and years, hidden behind paperwork that appeared compliant and procedures that functioned exactly as intended. From the outside, everything looked normal. Claims were submitted on time. Forms were filled out correctly. Required documents were attached. Payments were issued according to established rules. From the inside, however, something was wrong. Meal counts began to rise in ways that did not match reality. Reimbursements increased faster than participation should have allowed. Organizations reported levels of activity that were difficult to reconcile with their physical capacity. But because the system was designed to verify paperwork rather than reality, those inconsistencies did not immediately stop the flow of funds. The disappearance did not happen suddenly. It happened in plain sight. The funds at the center of this case came from a federal child nutrition program administered through the state of Minnesota. The purpose of the program was straightforward. It existed to ensure that children from low-income households had access to meals, especially during periods when schools were closed or when families faced economic hardship. For decades, variations of this program had operated across the United States. It was widely regarded as essential. In many communities, it served as a critical safety net, helping families maintain food security during difficult periods. The program was designed for speed and accessibility. Organizations approved under the program were permitted to prepare and distribute meals, then submit reimbursement claims based on the number of meals they reported serving. Those reimbursements were paid using public funds. The system relied heavily on documentation rather than real-time verification. Organizations submitted daily meal counts. Attendance records were filed. Vendor invoices were attached. These documents formed the basis of reimbursement claims. State agencies reviewed the paperwork for completeness and compliance. If the forms appeared correct and required documentation was included, payments were approved. Federal oversight existed, but it was largely indirect unless irregularities were flagged or audits were triggered. In effect, the system was built on trust. Trust that organizations were reporting honestly. Trust that the paperwork accurately reflected reality. Trust that problems would surface before they became serious. Under normal circumstances, this structure allowed the program to operate efficiently. It reduced administrative delays and ensured that meals could be delivered quickly to children in need. It minimized friction in a system designed to respond to urgent social needs. But efficiency came with a trade-off. Verification lagged behind reimbursement. Money moved first. Questions came later. As long as the documentation appeared correct on paper, funds continued to flow. The system was not designed to independently confirm whether reported meal counts matched actual operations. That lag was manageable when participation was limited and demand was stable. But when conditions changed, the gap between reimbursement and verification widened. Over time, the system became increasingly dependent on self-reported data. The more organizations participated, the more trust the system required to function. The design assumed that dishonest behavior would be rare and quickly detected. What it did not account for was the scale at which abuse could occur once those assumptions failed. The paperwork was doing its job. The reality behind it was not. By 2020, the conditions surrounding the program changed dramatically. The COVID-19 pandemic led to widespread school closures across Minnesota and the rest of the country. Millions of children who normally relied on school meal programs suddenly lost regular access to daily food services. The demand for alternative meal programs surged almost overnight. To respond, emergency rules were implemented at both the federal and state levels. Approval processes were expedited, oversight requirements were relaxed, the priority shifted toward speed and access, ensuring that meals could reach children as quickly as possible. More organizations were approved to participate in the program, including many newly formed nonprofits. In some cases, organizations received approval in a matter of weeks rather than months. On paper, the expansion appeared successful. Reported meal counts increased. Reimbursement totals surged. Official reports showed that thousands of children were being served each day across the state. But beneath those numbers, inconsistencies began to emerge. According to investigators, some organizations claimed to be serving volumes of meals that were difficult to reconcile with their physical capacity. Small storefronts and modest office spaces were reported as sites serving thousands of meals per day. Addresses began to overlap. Multiple organizations listed the same locations. Administrative details, including contact information and staffing, appeared across different nonprofits. Vendor invoices also began to show patterns that raised questions. Documents from different organizations followed similar formats, listed the same suppliers, and reported nearly identical costs. Despite these irregularities, payments continued. From an administrative perspective, claims appeared compliant. Documentation was submitted on time. Required forms were completed. Attendance sheets were included. Vendor invoices were attached. The system was functioning as designed. What it was not designed to do was question whether the reported numbers made sense. Internal concerns did surface. According to public reporting, state employees raised questions about unusually high meal counts and overlapping addresses. Auditors flagged discrepancies in documentation. Emails documented discomfort with the scale of reported activity. But the system was under pressure. Caseloads were high. Emergency rules limited the By the time the pandemic began reshaping daily life across the United States, the child nutrition program in Minnesota was already operating at a scale few had anticipated. What changed was not just the level of demand, but the pace at which decisions had to be made. School closures eliminated a primary source of daily meals for millions of children. Families who had relied on school cafeterias suddenly needed alternatives, and they needed them immediately. The existing system was never designed for this level of urgency. To prevent disruptions, federal and state agencies moved quickly. Emergency waivers were issued. Approval timelines were shortened. Documentation requirements were reduced or deferred. The emphasis shifted decisively toward speed. The goal was simple: keep food moving. As a result, participation in the program expanded rapidly. Organizations that had never operated meal programs before were approved. Existing nonprofits increased their reported capacity. New entities appeared almost overnight, presenting themselves as ready to meet the surge in demand. From the outside, the expansion appeared necessary and justified. Meal distribution numbers rose sharply. Reimbursement totals climbed. Reports showed that thousands of meals were being served daily across Minnesota, often in areas hit hardest by school closures. But the system was now under strain. The same trust-based structure that had worked under normal conditions was now supporting far more volume, far more participants, and far more money than before. State agencies responsible for reviewing claims faced growing backlogs. Staff were processing unprecedented numbers of reimbursement requests under compressed timelines. The ability to scrutinize individual submissions was limited. In many cases, claims were reviewed for completeness rather than plausibility. If forms were filled out correctly, if required documents were attached, and if submissions met basic procedural standards, payments moved forward. There was little capacity to verify whether the reported activity matched reality on the ground. This was not negligence in the traditional sense. It was a system responding to pressure exactly as it had been instructed to respond. Speed mattered more than certainty. As participation increased, the system became increasingly dependent on self-reported data. The accuracy of the entire program rested on the assumption that organizations were acting in good faith. That assumption would soon be tested. As the volume of claims grew, so did the opportunity for abuse. The combination of relaxed oversight, expedited approvals, and rising reimbursement amounts created conditions that were difficult to control. The system was moving faster than its safeguards. And at that speed, small inconsistencies were easy to overlook. As the program expanded, patterns began to emerge that would later become central to the investigation. Some organizations reported dramatic increases in meal counts within short periods of time. In certain cases, reported numbers doubled or tripled from one month to the next, without any corresponding change in infrastructure or staffing. On paper, these increases were explained by rising demand. In reality, they raised questions that were difficult to answer. According to investigators, several organizations claimed to be serving thousands of meals per day while operating out of locations that could not reasonably support that volume. Small offices, storefronts, and temporary facilities were listed as meal distribution sites for extraordinarily large numbers of children. The numbers did not always align with physical capacity. As participation grew, overlaps began to appear. Multiple organizations listed the same addresses. Some shared administrative staff, contact information, or operational details. In a system processing claims at high speed, these overlaps did not always trigger immediate scrutiny. Vendor relationships also began to show similarities. Invoices submitted by different organizations often followed the same structure, listed the same suppliers, and reported nearly identical costs. In some cases, vendors appeared repeatedly across unrelated nonprofits, raising questions about whether those suppliers were truly independent. Despite these similarities, reimbursements continued. From the perspective of the reviewing agencies, claims appeared procedurally compliant. Required documentation was present. Forms were completed correctly. Submissions met the criteria established under emergency rules. The system was doing what it had been directed to do. What it was not doing was evaluating whether the reported activity made sense when viewed as a whole. Internal concerns were raised during this period. According to public reporting, state employees questioned the plausibility of certain claims. Auditors noted discrepancies in reported volumes. Emails documented unease about overlapping addresses and unusually high reimbursement totals. But the response options were limited. Staffing levels had not increased at the same pace as participation. Emergency rules constrained the ability to delay or deny claims without clear evidence of wrongdoing. The pressure to maintain uninterrupted food access remained high. As a result, concerns were often noted but not acted upon immediately. The system favored continuity over caution. Each approved claim reinforced the appearance of legitimacy. Each reimbursement made the next one easier to process. Over time, patterns that might have raised alarms under normal circumstances became part of the background noise. By the time the scale of the problem became more apparent, the volume of money involved had already grown significantly. The program had expanded rapidly. Its ability to question itself had not. As the months passed, the gap between what was being reported and what could reasonably be verified continued to widen. The system had been designed to function on the assumption that most participants were acting in good faith. Under normal conditions, that assumption was rarely tested. Under pandemic conditions, it became a critical vulnerability. Claims were reviewed individually, not as part of a larger pattern. Each organization was assessed on its own paperwork, rather than in comparison to others operating in the same space. This made it difficult to see the full picture. A reimbursement request might look acceptable in isolation, but when viewed alongside dozens of similar requests from related organizations, the scale and coordination became more apparent. At the time, however, that broader view was largely missing. According to investigators, some organizations submitted claims day after day, reporting the same high volumes with little variation. Attendance sheets listed consistent numbers. Vendor invoices reflected steady costs. Everything appeared orderly, but real-world operations rarely behave that way. Variability is normal. Demand fluctuates. Staffing changes. Supply chains shift. The absence of those variations should have raised questions. Instead, consistency was interpreted as reliability. The system rewarded predictability. As long as claims looked stable and paperwork was complete, reimbursements continued without interruption. This created a feedback loop. Organizations that reported higher numbers received higher reimbursements. Those reimbursements reinforced the appearance of legitimacy. Over time, the reported activity became the accepted baseline. Any attempt to challenge those numbers now required stronger justification. Meanwhile, the administrative burden continued to grow. State agencies were processing record volumes of claims. Staff were stretched thin. Reviews were conducted under time pressure. The capacity to investigate anomalies was limited. Emergency rules remained in place longer than originally anticipated. The longer those rules stayed active, the more normalized the expanded oversight gaps became. By late 2020 and into 2021, the system had effectively adjusted to a new normal. Large reimbursements were routine. High-volume claims were common. The scale of the program was unlike anything seen before. From the outside, the program appeared to be functioning. Meals were being reported. Funds were being distributed. Public assurances emphasized continuity and access. Behind the scenes, however, the conditions that would eventually trigger a federal investigation. By the time investigators began piecing together what had happened, it became clear that the fraud did not rely on a single trick or loophole. It relied on repetition. According to federal indictments, the alleged scheme followed a consistent and methodical pattern that was repeated across multiple organizations. The process began with meal claims. Organizations reported the number of meals they claimed to have served each day. Those numbers formed the basis of reimbursement requests. The higher the reported meal count, the larger the payment. In many cases, those numbers were dramatically inflated. Attendance sheets listed children who were never present. Some listed names that could not be verified. Others reported the same numbers day after day, regardless of real-world conditions. These attendance records were submitted as supporting documentation, giving the appearance of legitimacy. Vendor invoices were then used to reinforce those claims. Organizations submitted invoices showing purchases of food, packaging, and supplies supposedly required to serve the reported number of meals. These invoices matched the scale of the claimed activity. On paper, the documents aligned. According to prosecutors, this alignment was intentional. In several cases, vendors listed on reimbursement claims were connected to the same individuals running the nonprofit organizations. Some vendors were shell companies created solely to generate invoices. Others existed only on paper, with no meaningful business operations at all. These vendors issued invoices for food that was never delivered. Those invoices were then attached to reimbursement requests, completing the paper trail. Once claims were approved, public funds were released. The money moved quickly. Funds were deposited into organizational accounts, then transferred to related entities or withdrawn in cash. In some cases, funds were routed through multiple accounts in a short period of time. According to investigators, this movement made it harder to trace the origin of the money and obscured how it was ultimately used. What made the scheme effective was not sophistication. It was consistency. The same process was repeated day after day, across multiple organizations, using paperwork that appeared complete and compliant. As long as the documents matched and forms were filled correctly, the system had little reason to intervene. The fraud did not depend on bypass. Once the reimbursements were approved and funds were released, the next phase of the scheme began. According to prosecutors, the money did not remain with the organizations for long. Funds were transferred rapidly between accounts, often within days of being deposited. In some cases, money moved through multiple related entities before reaching its final destination. This movement served two purposes. First, it made the money harder to track. By routing funds through different accounts and organizations, the original source of the money became less visible. Second, it allowed individuals involved in the scheme to access the funds for personal use. Court filings alleged that public money intended for child nutrition was used for expenses unrelated to food services. These included luxury vehicles, real estate purchases, personal travel, and large cash withdrawals. In some cases, funds were withdrawn in amounts structured to avoid scrutiny. In others, money was spent openly, relying on the assumption that oversight would remain limited. What made this possible was the separation between reimbursement approval and post-payment review. Once funds were released, there were few immediate controls on how they were spent. Reviews, when they occurred, often came months later, long after the money had already been moved or spent. According to investigators, some organizations maintained the appearance of legitimacy by continuing to submit claims consistently. As long as new reimbursement requests were approved, earlier payments attracted little attention. The scheme relied on momentum. Each successful claim reinforced the perception that the organization was operating properly. Over time, the volume of approved reimbursements created an illusion of scale and credibility. This illusion discouraged scrutiny. Questioning one organization meant questioning dozens of previously approved claims. It meant acknowledging that the system itself might have failed. As a result, intervention was slow. Another factor that enabled the scheme was the lack of coordination between oversight bodies. State agencies reviewed paperwork. Federal authorities monitored programs at a higher level. Financial institutions processed transactions but were not positioned to understand the context behind them. Each entity saw only a fragment of the activity. No single agency had immediate visibility into the full scope of the operation. According to prosecutors, this fragmentation allowed suspicious behavior to continue without triggering decisive action. Large transfers were not unusual in the context of program reimbursements. High balances were not automatically suspicious. Frequent transactions were consistent with high-volume operations. The activity blended into the background. By the time investigators began assembling the pieces, the scheme had already operated for an extended period. The money was gone. The paper trail, however, remained. And that paper trail would eventually become the key to unraveling the operation. As the alleged scheme continued, a question became increasingly important. Why didn't the warning sign stop it? According to investigators and public reporting, the answer was not a single failure, but a combination of structural limitations that reinforced one another. First, oversight was fragmented. State agencies were responsible for reviewing reimbursement paperwork. Federal authorities oversaw the program at a higher level. Financial institutions processed transactions without visibility into the underlying purpose of the funds. Each group saw only a portion of the activity. No single entity had immediate access to the full picture. Second, the system was designed to evaluate compliance, not plausibility. Reviewers checked whether forms were complete, whether required documents were attached, and whether submissions met procedural rules. They were not equipped to independently verify whether reported meal counts matched real-world operations. A claim could be compliant and still be false. Third, the scale of participation made comparison difficult. As more organizations joined the program, high volumes became normalized. Large reimbursement amounts no longer stood out. Patterns that might have seemed suspicious early on blended into the overall surge. Consistency was interpreted as reliability. Organizations that submitted the same numbers repeatedly were seen as predictable. In reality, that predictability masked manipulation. Fourth, the pandemic context constrained intervention. Emergency rules limited the ability to delay or deny claims without clear evidence of wrongdoing. The priority remained uninterrupted food access. Any action that risked slowing payments carried political and social consequences. According to public reporting, internal concerns were raised. Emails documented unease about overlapping addresses, repeated vendor names, and implausible meal counts. Auditors flagged discrepancies. Staff questioned whether reported activity was realistic. But raising concerns did not automatically translate into stopping payments. To halt reimbursements required formal findings, documented violations, and legal justification. By the time those thresholds were met, the alleged activity had already continued for months. The system favored continuity. Once reimbursements became routine, stopping them required more effort than allowing them to continue. Finally, the scheme relied on volume. According to prosecutors, the alleged fraud did not depend on a single large theft. It depended on repeating the same process over and over, across many organizations, each submitting claims that appeared ordinary in isolation. Individually, claims looked manageable. Collectively, they became enormous. By the time the full scope began to emerge, the money had already moved through multiple accounts. Assets had been purchased. Funds had been withdrawn. Recovering them would prove difficult. What remained was the documentation. Attendance sheets, vendor invoices, bank records, reimbursement logs. The same paperwork that had allowed the fraud to proceed would now become the evidence used to investigate. The shift from quiet concern to formal investigation did not happen overnight. According to court records, the turning point came when the scale and coordination of the activity could no longer be explained as isolated errors or administrative confusion. Federal investigators began examining the program more closely. What started as compliance reviews expanded into criminal inquiries. Financial records were subpoenaed. Bank accounts were analyzed. Patterns that had been invisible when viewed in isolation became clearer when examined together. According to indictments, investigators identified networks of organizations connected through shared addresses, overlapping leadership, and common vendors. The same names appeared repeatedly across different entities. Money flowed between accounts in ways that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Search warrants were executed, documents were seized, electronic records were examined. Investigators traced reimbursement payments from state agencies to nonprofit accounts, then onward to related businesses and personal expenditures. The movement of funds revealed a consistent pattern that aligned with the alleged fraud scheme. Public reporting later showed that investigators focused heavily on documentation. Attendance sheets, vendor invoices, reimbursement requests, and bank statements were cross-referenced to identify discrepancies. What had once appeared as ordinary paperwork now took on new meaning. According to prosecutors, the same documents that had allowed payments to proceed were used to reconstruct the flow of money and establish intent. As the investigation progressed, the scope widened. What initially appeared to involve a small number of organizations expanded to include dozens. The alleged activity spanned months, then years. The total amounts involved continued to grow as additional claims were reviewed. This expansion raised difficult questions. How had so much money moved through the system without being stopped? Who was responsible for oversight failures? And how much of the money could realistically be recovered? As investigators worked through these questions, preparations for charges began. Grand jury proceedings were initiated. Evidence was compiled, and the case moved from administrative review into the criminal justice system. The investigation had reached a point where quiet corrections were no longer possible. What followed would play out publicly. As the investigation moved forward, the first public signs of its scope began to emerge through indictments. Federal prosecutors announced charges against dozens of individuals connected to the program. The allegations included wire fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. According to court filings, the total amount involved reached into the hundreds of millions of dollars. The scale of the case immediately set it apart. This was not a single defendant or a single organization. It was a network of nonprofits, vendors, and individuals whose activities were alleged to be coordinated over an extended period of time. Court documents described how organizations submitted false claims, generated fraudulent invoices, and used the resulting funds for personal benefit. Prosecutors laid out timelines showing how reimbursements were approved, transferred, and spent. As defendants appeared in court, the details became public. Some pleaded not guilty and contested the charges. Others entered plea agreements, acknowledging their role in the scheme in exchange for reduced sentences. Court proceedings revealed the breadth of the alleged operation. According to prosecutors, multiple organizations followed nearly identical patterns. The same vendors appeared across different cases. The same methods were used to inflate meal counts and justify reimbursements. Witness testimony and documentary evidence were used to demonstrate intent. Emails, financial records, and internal communications were introduced to show coordination between parties. The narrative presented by prosecutors was one of deliberate planning rather than opportunistic abuse. Defense attorneys challenged that narrative. They argued that the program was chaotic during the pandemic, that rules were unclear, and that mistakes were inevitable under emergency conditions. They pointed to inconsistent guidance, shifting requirements, and limited oversight as contributing factors. The courtroom became the place where these competing explanations were tested. Beyond individual guilt or innocence, the proceedings exposed how fragile the system had become under pressure. Judges questioned how oversight had failed so extensively. Public officials were asked to explain approval processes and internal controls. The case drew national attention. It raised concerns about other emergency programs created during crises. If this could happen in one state, observers asked, could it happen elsewhere? As hearings continued and more details emerged, one conclusion became difficult to ignore. This was not merely a case about fraud. It was a case about how systems behave when speed replaces scrutiny. And the legal process was now forcing those questions into the open. As court proceedings continued, attention shifted from individual defendants to the broader consequences of the case. How much money could be recovered remained uncertain. According to public officials, significant portions of the funds had already been spent, transferred, or converted into assets that were difficult to seize. Even where recoveries were possible, the process would take years. Civil actions were initiated alongside criminal cases. Assets were frozen. Properties were seized. Financial records were reviewed in an effort to trace remaining funds. But the reality was clear. Much of the money intended to feed children would never be returned. In response to the scandal, oversight rules were tightened. Approval processes were revised. Auditing requirements were strengthened. Emergency waivers were rolled back. State agencies implemented additional checks designed to identify implausible claims earlier. Data sharing between departments increased. Comparisons across organizations became more systematic. These changes were necessary. They were also overdue. The case prompted broader discussions about how emergency programs should be designed in the future. Policymakers were forced to confront difficult trade-offs between speed and accountability. Programs built to respond quickly to crises are inherently vulnerable to abuse. Yet delaying assistance can carry its own human costs. The Minnesota case illustrated how difficult it is to balance those competing priorities. For many observers, the most troubling aspect of the scandal was not the fraud itself, but how long it was able to continue. Warnings were raised, discrepancies were noted, concerns were documented, but action came only after the scale of the problem could no longer be ignored. The system did not fail loudly. It failed quietly. It failed by doing exactly what it was designed to do, even when the assumptions behind that design no longer held. This case serves as a cautionary example, not just for Minnesota, but for any system that relies heavily on trust without sufficient verification, especially during periods of crisis. Fraud thrives in gaps. It grows where oversight lags behind urgency, and it often remains invisible until the damage is already done. The Minnesota fraud case is now part of the public record. Its lessons, however, are still being learned, and the question it leaves behind is not simply who was responsible, but whether future systems will be built to recognize the warning signs sooner.